It was a chilly evening when the restaurant lights began to glow softly through the wide glass windows. The place was one of those spots where people came to unwind after long days, filled with chatter, the clinking of glasses and slow background music from an old speaker. The air smelled of roasted meat, freshly baked bread, and laughter. Most of the tables were full, and the staff moved quickly from one customer to another, balancing trays and taking orders with polite smiles. At the corner near the entrance, the heavy glass door opened slightly. A cold breeze entered, followed by a thin woman in a faded coat. Her shoes looked worn, and her hands clutched a small brown bag as if it held everything she owned. She didn't walk with the confidence of a customer, more like someone unsure if they even belonged there. The hostess at the counter looked up with mild surprise. It wasn't common to see someone like her in that fine place. The woman stood quietly, glancing around as if she was afraid to disturb anyone. Her eyes settled on the piano standing in the far corner of the restaurant. It was old but beautiful, with a few scratches along the edges and a faint shine that suggested it hadn't been played much in a long time. After a deep breath, she walked toward the counter, her steps soft but determined. "Excuse me," she said in a low, almost trembling voice. The young hostess leaned forward, not sure she had heard correctly. "Can I play your piano?" The woman asked again, then added hesitantly, "Just for a meal." The words hung in the air for a moment. The hostess blinked, unsure how to respond. "You want to play the piano?" "For food," she repeated, a little confused. A waiter passing by overheard and gave a small laugh. He whispered something to another waiter, and soon a few heads turned toward the woman, curious and amused. The manager, a tall man with neatly combed hair, came over. He looked the woman up and down, the worn clothes, the tired face, and frowned slightly. "Madam, this isn't that kind of place," he said, trying to sound polite but failing to hide his doubt. "I understand," she replied softly. "I just thought, if I could play something, maybe I could earn a meal." Her voice was calm but carried a kind of quiet dignity that made him pause for a second. Still, the tables nearby had already started whispering. A young man sitting with his date chuckled. "This should be good," he said loudly enough for others to hear. The woman at his table giggled, shaking her head. She probably can't even play. The manager glanced at the piano, then back at her. Maybe, he thought, letting her play for a few minutes would end the matter quickly. It might even entertain the guests. "All right," he said finally, crossing his arms. "Go ahead. Play us something." "But only one song." The woman nodded gratefully, her eyes lighting up with relief. She walked slowly toward the piano, her steps steady now. The waiters exchanged amused looks, gathering near the counter to watch. Some guests turned in their seats, expecting something silly or awkward. The chatter in the restaurant softened, and a few people smirked as she pulled out the piano bench and sat down. For a moment, she didn't play. She simply ran her hand over the keys, wiping off a thin layer of dust with her sleeve. Her fingers lingered there, as if greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her back, and placed both hands on the keys. The first note she played was soft, almost uncertain, but it rang through the room with a clear, delicate sound. A few people turned their heads, surprised by the tone. Then came another note, then another, slow at first, like the beginning of a memory. Within moments, the melody began to form, gentle yet full of feeling. The waiters stopped whispering. The laughter faded. Even the kitchen door stopped swinging as the cooks peeked through the window to see who was playing. Her hands began to move faster, more confidently, and the music deepened. It wasn't the kind of tune that showed off speed or power. It was emotional, sad yet hopeful, fragile but strong. It filled every corner of the restaurant, wrapping around the people listening, pulling them into her world. The couple that had laughed earlier now sat silently, watching her with wide eyes. The young man lowered his drink slowly. The woman beside him leaned forward, her smile gone, replaced by something like awe. Near the counter, the hostess felt a lump in her throat. She had never heard anything like it. It was as if the piano itself had come alive. Each note carried something deeper: pain, love, loss, and longing. The woman playing seemed to forget where she was. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly as she let the music guide her. When she reached the middle of the piece, the melody grew more powerful. Her fingers danced effortlessly, moving faster, then slowing down again like waves crashing and retreating. Some of the guests had tears in their eyes without knowing why. They couldn't explain it, but the music touched something inside them. By the time she struck the last chord, the restaurant was completely silent. The final note lingered in the air, echoing softly before fading away. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if time itself had stopped. Then someone started clapping. Another joined, and within moments the entire room erupted in applause. The woman opened her eyes slowly, startled. She looked around as if waking from a dream. People were standing now, clapping, cheering. A few even whistled. The same man who had laughed earlier now looked embarrassed, avoiding eye contact with her. The manager, who had crossed his arms in doubt, was now clapping too, his expression mixed with admiration and guilt. The woman stood up quietly and gave a small bow, her face humble. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice trembled a little, not from fear but from emotion. The manager walked toward her, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was incredible," he said, his tone completely changed. "You weren't joking," she smiled faintly. "No, sir. I never joke about music." The guests continued to applaud as she stepped back from the piano. Some began asking who she was, if she had trained professionally or where she had learned to play like that. The woman didn't answer much. She simply said, "I used to play a long time ago." The hostess hurried to bring her a seat near the counter and whispered to the kitchen to prepare a full meal for her. The manager didn't even have to say it. It just felt right. When the food arrived, steaming soup, warm bread, and a plate of rice with vegetables, the woman looked at it with quiet gratitude. She hadn't eaten properly in days. As she took her first bite, the piano still stood there behind her, silent again, yet glowing softly in the light. It had witnessed something pure, something honest. The guests continued to talk in low voices, still amazed by what they had seen. Some even walked up to her table to thank her personally. One woman said, "You reminded me what real music feels like." Another said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." The woman listened, nodded, and smiled shyly. She didn't seem proud or boastful, only peaceful. The meal was simple, but she ate it slowly, savoring every bite as if it was more than food. It was respect, it was dignity restored. Before leaving, she turned once more toward the piano. Her eyes softened. She ran her fingers gently over the keys again, whispering something under her breath that no one could hear. Maybe it was a thank you, or maybe it was goodbye. Then she put on her old coat, picked up her worn bag, and walked to the door. The cold wind met her again as she stepped outside, but this time she didn't seem as small or as fragile. The people inside watched her leave, and for a moment the restaurant stayed quiet. After she was gone, the young waiter who had laughed earlier turned to his coworker. "Who do you think she was?" he asked softly. The hostess shook her head, still staring at the piano. "I don't know," she said. But whoever she was, she played like someone who had lived 1,000 lives. The manager stood there for a while, deep in thought. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a reminder that not everything could be measured by appearances or money. Sometimes beauty came from the most unexpected places. Outside, the woman walked down the dim street, her coat fluttering in the breeze. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. For that one evening, she had not been hungry, nor forgotten. Her music had spoken for her, louder than any words ever could. And though she didn't know it yet, that one simple request, "Can I play for just a meal?" would soon change everything. The next evening, the restaurant was just as busy. The warm lights glowed through the glass walls, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and soft conversation. The same piano stood in the corner, quiet and polished now. After what had happened the previous night, it seemed to hold a kind of magic in it. The staff had cleaned it carefully that morning, though they never admitted why. Something about the way that woman had played still lingered in their minds. But most of the guests didn't know what had happened. To them, it was just another fancy place to dine, another night to relax. New customers came in, dressed well, carrying the confidence of those who never had to worry about a meal. The staff smiled, took orders, and carried on as usual. But beneath their calm service, they couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had played so beautifully and disappeared without a name. It was close to 8 when the glass door opened again. A cold breeze slipped in, and there she was, the same woman in the same old coat. Her shoes were still worn, her face still thin, but her eyes looked more at peace than before. She stood near the doorway for a moment, unsure if she should walk in. The hostess noticed her first. For a second, surprise flashed across her face. Then she smiled faintly and hurried over. "You came back," she said softly, trying to hide her excitement. The woman nodded. "I hope it's all right," she said. "I didn't mean to cause trouble last night." "Trouble?" the hostess whispered. "You were the best thing that happened here in months." She quickly led her inside. But not everyone was as welcoming. A group of new waiters who hadn't been there the previous night whispered among themselves. They saw her coat, her tired face, and smirked quietly. "What's she doing here?" one of them murmured. "Maybe she's here to beg again," another laughed under his breath. "Or maybe she wants another free meal." The older waiter who had seen her play turned sharply. "You should keep quiet," he said firmly. "You don't know what she can do." They looked at him with amusement. "What, she's a magician now?" one said jokingly. "She's a pianist," the older waiter replied. "And not just any pianist." But before he could say more, the manager walked in. He saw the woman and froze for a moment. He remembered the way the restaurant had gone silent when she played, how every note had touched even the coldest hearts. Yet part of him still felt uneasy. Maybe it had been a lucky moment, he thought. Maybe it wouldn't happen again. The woman looked around nervously. "I was wondering," she began softly, "if I could play again. I don't need food this time. I just want to play." The manager crossed his arms, pretending to think. "You don't want a meal?" She shook her head. "No, sir. I just want to play," he hesitated. It wasn't usual for a customer, or rather a stranger, to perform without permission. Some guests were already glancing her way, curious. "All right," he said after a pause. "Just one piece." The woman bowed slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. As she walked toward the piano, a few of the guests started whispering again. Some remembered the gossip from the previous night, the story of a poor woman who had played like a master. Others didn't believe it. "Maybe she was just lucky," one man said, sipping his drink. "Let's see if she can do it again." She reached the piano and sat down. Her hands rested on her lap for a moment before she touched the keys. The chatter around her grew louder, mixed with laughter and doubt. The waiters at the counter leaned in, waiting for the first note. But before she began, something unexpected happened. A group of young people near the bar started making jokes about her coat, about how she didn't fit in. One of them even said, "I bet she can't play anything real." The words stung, but she didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed on the piano. Her fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. She was trying to hold back emotion. She took a deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound that came out was calm and soft, like a whisper. The laughter around her faded for a second. Then came another note and another, flowing gently like water. It was a new melody, different from the night before. Slow, haunting, and full of quiet strength. The restaurant began to grow silent again, one person at a time. The waiters stopped moving, forks stopped midair, and even the sound of glasses stopped clinking. The music filled the air with something unexplainable. It was not just sound, it was feeling. Her hands moved gracefully, each note carrying a piece of her story. The mockery had vanished. In its place, awe spread through the crowd. The same people who had whispered now stared, caught off guard by how deeply the music reached into them. The older waiter, standing by the counter, smiled quietly. He had known it wasn't luck. He watched the young waiters beside him, their mouths slightly open, their faces soft with disbelief. The woman kept playing. The melody grew richer, deeper, and more emotional. Her back straightened, her movements became lighter, faster. She played like someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to say. It was as if her fingers told a story of hardship, hope, and resilience all at once. In one corner, a child leaned forward on his chair, his wide eyes fixed on her hands. An elderly man near the window closed his eyes, lost in the memory that the music stirred in him. Even the manager felt his chest tighten, though he tried to hide it. As the final notes drifted away, silence filled the room again. Then came the sound of clapping, soft at first, then louder until the entire restaurant was applauding. Some people stood up. Others wiped their eyes discreetly. The woman turned slightly, her expression gentle and humble. "Thank you," she said softly. She didn't smile widely, but her eyes shone faintly. She stood up slowly from the piano and bowed slightly to the guests. The same group that had mocked her earlier now looked down at their plates, ashamed. The manager walked forward, still clapping. "That," he said quietly, "was not something you hear every day." The woman nodded and whispered, "Thank you for letting me play." One of the guests stood up and asked, "How do you play like that? Who taught you?" The woman hesitated for a long time before answering. "Life did," she said softly, "and hunger and love and loss." Her voice trembled on the last word, but she smiled again, this time faintly, as if remembering something painful yet beautiful. The manager insisted she stay and eat again, but she politely refused. "I'm not hungry," she said. "Your kindness yesterday gave me more than food could." The hostess followed her outside for a moment, holding out a small envelope. "Some of the guests wanted to give you this," she said gently. The woman shook her head. "Please tell them thank you," she replied. "But I didn't play for money. I just needed to feel alive again." Then she walked down the street, her figure small against the glow of the city lights. The wind blew gently, carrying a faint echo of the music behind her. Inside, the restaurant stayed quiet for a long time. The young waiters didn't joke anymore. The manager stood by the piano, lost in thought. He reached out and pressed one of the keys. It made a dull sound, not beautiful, not magical, just a simple note. Then he smiled slightly. "It's not the piano," he whispered. "It's her," the hostess nodded. "Yes," she said. "It's her heart." The rest of the evening passed quietly. The guests spoke softly, as if afraid to break the fragile peace her music had left behind. The piano stood there like a silent witness, holding the echoes of her melody deep in its keys. Outside, the woman walked slowly along the dimly lit street, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. The city was noisy again. Cars, voices, the hum of life, but in her mind, the music still played. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or if she would ever return to that restaurant again. But she carried something inside her now, something that no hunger, no mockery, no hardship could ever take away. She had found her strength again, one note at a time. The following week came quietly. Days passed and the city carried on with its usual rush, people running to work, cars honking, shops opening and closing. But inside the restaurant, something had changed. The piano that once gathered dust now had a quiet importance. The staff no longer saw it as just decoration. It had become a symbol of something real, something that reminded them of the woman who had played it. Every morning, the hostess would walk past the piano and pause for a moment, touching its edge as if expecting her to appear again. The older waiter sometimes found himself glancing at the door during dinner hours, half hoping, half doubting that she'd come back. One rainy evening, when the restaurant was half full, the glass door opened again. The staff turned almost instantly, as if they'd been waiting for it. The woman stepped in, her coat damp from the rain, droplets clinging to her hair. She looked thinner than before, but her eyes held that same quiet calm. The hostess smiled the moment she saw her. "You're back," she said softly. The woman nodded gently. "If it's all right," she said, "I'd like to play again." The manager, who had been watching from the side, walked over. This time he didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said. "The piano is yours." A few customers who had seen her before began to whisper excitedly. Others, new to the place, looked confused. They didn't yet know what was about to happen. The woman took off her wet coat and placed it neatly over a chair. Then she sat down at the piano. The restaurant was still busy, the sound of forks against plates, people talking, soft laughter. But slowly, as she lifted her hands and pressed the first key, the noise began to fade. It was just one note, but it was pure. It hung in the air like a bell in the rain. Then another note followed and another. Within seconds, the sounds started weaving together into something more, a melody that was both fragile and powerful. The first part of her music was soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper from the heart. But as the rhythm built, the energy changed. Her fingers moved with purpose, faster, more confident. Every note seemed to carry a story, a feeling, a piece of her life. People began to turn in their chairs. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even those who had come to celebrate birthdays or business deals forgot their food. All eyes slowly drifted toward her. Her face had changed completely. The quiet, tired woman who had walked in moments ago was gone. In her place sat someone alive, radiant with something only music could awaken. Her hands moved so gracefully it looked like they were floating. Each touch on the keys sent emotion spilling into the room. Sadness, hope, joy all at once. The older waiter leaned against the counter, listening in silence. The hostess stood near the doorway, tears glistening in her eyes. She had never seen anyone play like this before, not even professionals. This was different. It wasn't about skill or fame, it was about truth. Her music began to tell a story without words. It spoke of nights spent alone, of hunger, of dreams left behind, and of strength found again. The melody rose and fell like breathing, sometimes quiet and broken, sometimes strong and defiant. A man at one of the tables lowered his glass and leaned forward, completely still. A young woman across the room covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filled with emotion. A child sitting near his mother whispered, "It sounds like she's talking with the piano." His mother nodded but couldn't speak. The rain outside tapped gently against the windows, blending softly with her music. It was as if the world itself had stopped to listen. The lights above the table shimmered on her hands as they moved. Quick but never rushed, precise but filled with feeling. At one point, she closed her eyes and tilted her head slightly back, letting the sound carry her away. She didn't see the people watching. She didn't see their faces. She was somewhere else, perhaps remembering a time when music was her life before it all fell apart. When she reached the middle of the piece, the notes became stronger. The melody turned into something almost like a storm, fast, emotional, powerful. Her fingers flew across the keys, yet every sound was clear and alive. The piano itself seemed to tremble, as if it too was feeling her story. Then, just as suddenly, the storm quieted. The sound softened again, delicate and peaceful. She slowed down, her touch so light it was as if she was afraid to wake the world from a dream. The melody faded slowly, each note stretching like a final breath until the last sound disappeared completely. The silence that followed was deep and unreal. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one by one, people began to clap. The sound grew louder, filling the space until it felt like the walls were shaking. Some stood up, unable to hold their emotion. Others wiped tears quietly, pretending they weren't crying. The woman opened her eyes slowly, breathing out as if waking from a long sleep. She looked around, almost surprised to see everyone standing. Then she smiled faintly, shyly, and bowed her head. The applause went on for what felt like minutes. The manager clapped too, this time without hesitation or doubt. The young waiters who had once mocked her clapped the loudest, their faces red with shame and admiration. The older waiter simply stood still, smiling softly to himself, proud that he had witnessed it again. When the applause finally began to fade, the woman stood up slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried warmth. "Music has been my only friend for a long time." The manager stepped forward, still a little dazed. "You're extraordinary," he said. "You don't belong out there wandering. You belong on a stage." She shook her head gently. "Life doesn't always go the way we plan," she said with a small smile. "Sometimes it takes everything away, but it can't take what's inside." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Everyone listening understood them, even if they couldn't explain why. The hostess offered her a seat and some tea, which she accepted gratefully. She sipped it slowly, her fingers still trembling from the performance. The people around her started coming forward one by one, some to thank her, others to ask questions. One man said softly, "I could feel your pain in that song, but I could also feel hope." She looked up and nodded. "That's what life is," she said. "Pain and hope together." Another woman asked, "Do you play anywhere else? Do you teach?" She smiled faintly. "Not anymore," she said. "But once I used to." They didn't press her further. Somehow they all sensed there was a story behind her words, a story of loss and resilience, but they didn't need to hear the details. The music had already told it. When she finally stood to leave, the staff gathered near the door. The manager stopped her and said, "Please come back whenever you want." "You don't need to ask." She looked touched. "Thank you," she said softly. "Maybe I will." Then she stepped out into the rainy night once more. The door closed behind her, and the sound of rain filled the silence she left behind. Inside, the staff remained still for a long while. The older waiter went to the piano and touched one of the keys, pressing it gently. A soft note echoed through the empty room. "You know," he said quietly, "she doesn't just play music, she speaks through it." The hostess nodded. "And she makes everyone listen." That night, when the restaurant closed and the lights dimmed, The piano stayed there, still but somehow alive, as if it carried her spirit within its keys. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the streets clean, while somewhere in the distance the woman walked alone, her steps slow but sure. She had no idea that her simple request to play for a meal had begun to change not just her life, but the hearts of everyone who had heard her play. The world had been cruel to her, but in those few minutes of music, she had found something precious: respect, warmth, and the reminder that her gift still mattered, and though she didn't know it yet, her journey was far from over. A few days passed, and the story of the mysterious pianist had begun to spread quietly around the city. It wasn't in the newspapers, and no one knew her name, but the people who had been there couldn't stop talking about her. They told their friends, their co-workers, even strangers sitting next to them on the bus, about the thin woman in an old coat who walked into a restaurant and played like someone born for it. Every time someone told the story, the memory grew stronger. Some said her music sounded like hope, others said it made them cry. The restaurant, once just another fancy spot among many, began to attract new customers who had heard whispers about the woman who played for Emile. The piano, which had been silent for months, now sat proudly in the center of the room. It was no longer just decoration. It was a symbol of humility, of hidden beauty, of how sometimes the most extraordinary people come from the most unexpected places. One evening, as the sun was setting and the restaurant filled with its golden light, the door opened once again. The staff recognized her immediately. The hostess was the first to smile. "You came back," she said, her voice warm with excitement. The woman gave a small nod. "If it's still all right," she said softly, "I'd like to play again." The manager didn't even hesitate. "The piano has been waiting for you," he said with a grin. "So have we." A few of the regular customers who had seen her perform before exchanged excited looks. Some new faces glanced around, curious about what was happening. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as evening settled in. The woman placed her old bag near the piano, brushed her fingers gently across the keys, and took a deep breath. The first notes she played were soft, so soft that at first no one noticed. But then the melody began to unfold, slow and graceful, like dawn spreading across the sky. Within moments, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant changed. The laughter, the chatter, the sound of clinking glasses, it all faded into silence. Her music filled every corner, wrapping around each listener like a warm blanket. This time her playing felt different. It was lighter, freer. There was still sadness in it, but now there was something more: joy, confidence, life. She wasn't just playing to earn a meal anymore. She was playing because she wanted to. Her hands glided across the piano like flowing water. The melody rose and fell, full of color and feeling. Some guests leaned forward without realizing it. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound take them somewhere far away, to memories they had forgotten, or feelings they hadn't felt in years. At one table sat an elderly man who used to play the violin when he was young. His eyes glistened as he listened. At another table, a mother held her child's hand, whispering softly, "Listen carefully. This is what real music sounds like." Even the chefs peeked out from the kitchen, standing silently near the doorway. The waiters forgot their trays for a moment. The world outside continued as usual. Cars passing, rain falling, but inside that restaurant time had stopped. When the song reached its peak, the woman lifted her hands and struck the keys with power and grace. The sound was rich and full, vibrating through the air. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of someone who had found herself again. Then, just as slowly, the music softened. The final notes were tender, almost like a lullaby. She ended with her hands resting lightly on the piano, her eyes closed, breathing deeply. The silence that followed was heavy and beautiful. Then came the applause, louder, stronger than before. People stood up, clapping with genuine emotion. Some were smiling, others wiping away tears. The woman opened her eyes and smiled softly. She bowed her head in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. When the applause finally quieted, a few people approached her. One man said, "You play like someone who's been through a lifetime and lived to tell the story." She nodded gently. "Maybe that's true," she said. Another guest, a middle-aged woman, asked, "Do you have a family? Do they know how wonderfully you play?" Her eyes lowered for a moment. "Once," she said softly. "But life has a way of separating people. Music is what stayed. Her words hung in the air, honest and sad, yet strong. The manager approached her then, carrying a cup of tea. "You've given this place something it never had before," he said. "You remind people of what matters." The woman looked touched. "All I did was play," she said. He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "You reminded everyone that beauty doesn't ask for permission to exist." She smiled faintly at that. The tea warmed her hands as she sat quietly by the piano, listening to the soft hum of conversation starting again. But this time the tone in the room was different, gentler, warmer, as if everyone had shared something sacred together. After a while, a young girl walked up to her with her parents. She was holding a small notebook. "Can you sign this for me?" the girl asked shyly. The woman blinked in surprise. "Sign?" she repeated, unsure. "Yes," the girl said. "I want to remember you." The woman smiled, took the notebook, and wrote a single line before signing it. "Play with your heart, not your hands." The girl read it, smiled wide, and hugged the notebook tightly as she walked back to her parents. Later that night, when the restaurant had emptied and the lights were dimmed, the woman stayed a little longer. She played one last quiet tune, not for anyone else but for herself. The notes were simple and sweet, like a whisper to the soul. When she finished, she closed the piano lid softly and stood up. The manager watched her from the counter. "Will you come again?" he asked. She looked at him and smiled. "Maybe," she said. "Music goes where it's needed." Then she put on her coat and stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp. The streets glistened under the streetlights. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing softly on the wet pavement. As she disappeared into the night, the people inside the restaurant kept talking about her. Not just her music, but her presence, her quiet strength. They couldn't explain it, but something about her had changed them. Over the next few days, the story of the mysterious pianist began to spread even further. Some said she used to be a famous musician who had lost everything. Others believed she was a traveler, a wanderer carrying her music from place to place. No one knew the truth, but everyone agreed on one thing: she was unforgettable. One evening, a reporter came by, curious about the story he had heard. The manager told him everything: how she had come in asking to play for food, how people had mocked her, and how she had silenced them all with a single song. The reporter listened carefully, then said, "People need to hear this story." The manager hesitated. "She never told us her name," he said. "I don't think she wants attention." "Maybe not," the reporter replied. "But sometimes stories like this remind others to look deeper, to see the person, not the clothes." The article was published the next morning under the title, "The Woman Who Played for a Meal." It spread across the city, shared by people who didn't even know her. Soon everyone wanted to hear her play, not because she was famous, but because she was real. A week later, when she returned to the restaurant again, there were more people than ever before. Some had traveled from other neighborhoods just to see her. The moment she entered, the entire place went quiet. She seemed surprised by the attention, but her humility never changed. She sat at the piano and said softly, "This isn't about me. It's about music, the one thing that never leaves us." And then she played. That night, her music was even more powerful than before. It was no longer just about hunger or survival. It was about redemption, about being seen again after years of being invisible. When she finished, no one spoke. People stood with tears in their eyes, their hearts full, their spirits lifted. The transformation was not just hers. It belonged to everyone in that room. The crowd that night was bigger than ever. People stood along the walls, some even waiting outside the restaurant, just hoping to catch a glimpse or hear a few notes drifting through the open doors. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet anticipation. The old piano sat in the same spot by the window, gleaming under the dim lights as if it too knew something special was about to happen. The woman entered slowly, her steps calm but her eyes full of thought. She still wore her same old coat, her shoes worn at the edges, yet something about her presence had changed. There was confidence now, not pride, but peace. People noticed it immediately. She didn't walk like someone lost anymore. She walked like someone who had found her place again. The manager greeted her with a warm smile. "You've made quite an impression on this city," he said softly. "There's not a day that someone doesn't ask about you." She gave a faint smile. "I never meant for that to happen," she said quietly. I only wanted to play. That's exactly why people love you, he replied. You remind them that not everything beautiful comes with a price tag. She didn't answer. She only glanced toward the piano, her fingers twitching slightly as if calling her toward it. The crowd hushed the moment she sat down. The soft light from the chandelier fell across her face, highlighting the calmness in her eyes. When she placed her hands on the keys, the first sound that came out was so gentle, it was like a whisper. But the melody that followed was filled with emotion, rich, deep, and full of stories that only she knew. Her music spoke of years gone by. It spoke of small apartments where the only furniture that mattered was an old upright piano. It spoke of early mornings spent practicing when the rest of the world was asleep. It spoke of laughter once shared with someone she loved, and the silence that followed after they were gone. Every note told a story, and every story found its way into the hearts of those listening. There was something so human in the way she played, something raw, unfiltered, real. The audience didn't just hear her music. They felt her life through it. The sadness, the joy, the struggle. It was all there, flowing through the keys. Halfway through her performance, the melody changed. It grew brighter, faster. Her fingers danced across the piano, moving with strength and freedom. There was a spark now, the sound of rediscovery, of someone who had found her voice again. The people watched in awe. Some whispered softly to each other, wondering who she really was. A few had tears in their eyes. Then something unexpected happened. As she played the final few notes, a man near the back of the room stood up. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. He whispered to the person next to him, "That's her. I know that song." The woman didn't notice him at first. She was lost in the music. But when the last note faded and the room filled with applause, her eyes lifted. And then she saw him. For a brief second, her hands froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized him instantly. It was someone from her past, someone who had once been part of the world she left behind. The applause faded as the man slowly walked forward. The crowd, sensing the shift in the room, grew silent. He stopped near the piano. "It's been a long time," he said softly. She looked at him, unsure what to say. "Yes," she finally whispered. "It has." The manager stepped back, uncertain, watching the scene unfold. The room was so quiet that even the sound of a fork being set down could be heard. The man took a deep breath. "You disappeared," he said. "No one knew where you went. Everyone thought—" He stopped himself. "You were on every stage in this city once. And now you're here." Her eyes lowered. "I had to leave," she said. "Sometimes the world gets too loud. I needed silence to remember who I was." "You were brilliant," he said softly. "Everyone knew it. You had everything, fame, success, love from the audience. Why walk away?" She smiled faintly, a sad kind of smile. "Because I stopped hearing the music," she said. "It became noise. I was playing for applause, not for my heart." The man's eyes softened. "And now?" She looked down at the piano keys. "Now I play because I must," she said. "Because it's the only thing that keeps me alive." For a moment the room remained utterly still. The crowd could feel the weight of her words. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a revelation. The man nodded slowly. "You haven't lost it," he said. "If anything, you found something more." She met his eyes, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had shared a past, one full of music, maybe love, and certainly heartbreak. But that was long ago. He stepped back and said softly, "You should be heard again. The world needs your music." She looked around at the people watching, their faces full of emotion, and shook her head. "They've already heard me," she said gently. "And that's enough." Then she stood up. The crowd began clapping again, not just because of her music, but because of her truth. It wasn't fame or perfection that moved them. It was her courage to be real. After the crowd dispersed, the man waited by the door. She approached slowly. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "I only wanted to see if you were still—" "You?" "You didn't disturb me," she said kindly. "You just reminded me how far I've come." He smiled softly. "If you ever decide to come back, the stage will always be there." She looked out the window at the quiet street beyond. "The world out there never really stops," she said. "But I found my peace right here, among strangers who listen." With that, she walked away, leaving him standing in the doorway, watching her go. That night, The restaurant stayed open later than usual. People lingered, still caught up in the feeling her music had left behind. Some said it was like hearing the sound of forgiveness. Others said it felt like seeing the soul of a person for the first time. The manager sat by the piano long after everyone had gone, touching the keys softly, as if they still held her warmth. He thought about her words. "I play because it keeps me alive." The next morning, when the restaurant opened again, there was a letter waiting on the piano. It was written in neat handwriting, folded carefully. It said, "Thank you for giving me a place to remember who I am. Music is not something we own, it's something we share. I will return when the music calls again." The manager smiled as he read it. He placed the letter inside a small frame and set it beside the piano. People who came in afterward would often stop to read it, feeling a quiet connection to the woman they had only seen once or twice. Days turned into weeks. She didn't return immediately, but her story stayed alive. The restaurant became known as the place where the pianist played. Musicians began visiting, hoping to touch the same keys she had touched. Some said they felt inspired. Others said they could still sense her spirit there. And somewhere far away in a quiet neighborhood, the woman continued to play, not for money, not for fame, but for the joy of hearing her own heart again. She would play for children on the street, for old neighbors who passed by her window, for anyone who stopped to listen. Her music wasn't loud or grand. It was soft, personal, and full of life. Every note carried a message, that sometimes the most beautiful songs are born from silence, and that even when the world forgets you, your gift never really leaves. And though she had walked away from the bright lights, her story had already reached farther than she ever imagined. The article about her had been shared again, spreading to towns and cities beyond. People who had lost hope read her story and found comfort in it. She became a quiet legend, not the kind who filled concert halls, but the kind whose name was spoken softly with warmth. Every once in a while, she would pass by the restaurant at night, peeking through the window. The piano still stood there, shining softly under the light. She would smile to herself, whisper something no one else could hear, and walk away. The music had led her back to herself, and that was all she ever needed. The following weeks passed quietly, yet the city seemed a little brighter. People who had heard the story of the woman who played for a meal could not stop talking about her. It wasn't just her music. It was the honesty of her presence, the way she carried herself, the courage in her quiet actions. Everyone who had seen her play remembered the feeling it left behind, like a gentle reminder that beauty often lives in unexpected places. The restaurant, too, had changed. The piano no longer seemed like a corner decoration. It had become something sacred, a place where people could feel the presence of someone extraordinary. Even the staff who had once laughed at the idea of a poor woman performing now treated it with reverence. They polished it carefully every day, sometimes running their fingers over the keys and remembering the magic that had filled the room. One cool evening, as the sun set behind the tall buildings and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, the glass door opened again. The woman walked in slowly, her coat wrapped tightly around her. She had grown thinner since the first time she came, but her eyes carried a quiet strength. The staff greeted her warmly. The manager approached her with a soft smile. "You've come back," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. She nodded. "I thought it was time," she said. "Time to share a little more." The restaurant had filled with people who had heard her story. Some were regulars, others had come from different parts of the city, curious about the woman who had touched so many hearts. The crowd was buzzing softly, anticipation blending with the faint aroma of bread and roasted meat. Yet when she walked to the piano and placed her hands on the keys, the room seemed to hold its breath. The first note was soft, barely more than a whisper. Then another followed, and another, weaving a melody that seemed to float on the air. This time her playing felt even more alive. There was confidence in every movement, yet humility in every note. The music told a story without words, a story of hardship, resilience, and rediscovery. People leaned forward instinctively. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound pull them into her world. Others sat quietly, captivated by the raw emotion in her hands. A child near the front whispered to his mother, "It's like she's talking without words." The melody grew richer, deeper, stronger. Her fingers moved as if guided by memories she had lived 1,000 times. There was joy in her music now, not just sadness or longing. She played like someone who had finally found herself, someone who had learned that beauty could survive even in the harshest conditions. Halfway through, a hush fell over the restaurant. The soft clinking of forks and glasses stopped. The air seemed heavy with meaning, charged by the notes she played. Every person listening felt a connection to her, as if she was speaking to each of them individually. The manager watched from the side, unable to take his eyes off her. The hostess stood by the doorway, tears quietly forming at the corners of her eyes. Even the young waiters who had once mocked her could not help but feel awe. They had never seen anything like it. The woman continued to play. The notes rose and fell like waves, sometimes tender and calm, sometimes strong and urgent. Her hands moved quickly but precisely, effortlessly shifting between melodies that spoke of hope, love, loss, and triumph. The piano seemed to breathe with her, alive in a way that made everyone feel they were witnessing something magical. As the final moments of the piece approached, she paused for a heartbeat, letting the silence hang in the room. Then she pressed the last chord with a soft but certain touch. The sound lingered, stretching into the quiet, leaving a gentle echo that seemed to settle in the hearts of everyone listening. The applause started slowly, then grew into a steady wave. Some people stood, some cried quietly, and others whispered to one another about the beauty they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a performance. It was a gift, one that had transformed the entire room. The woman stood, her hands resting lightly on the piano. She looked at the crowd, her eyes soft and calm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening. Music is not just sound. It is life, and we carry it in our hearts whether we play or not." The manager stepped forward. "You've given everyone here more than a performance," he said. "You've reminded them of something they forgot, that the simplest, most honest things can touch the deepest parts of our hearts." She nodded, quietly acknowledging his words. "I've learned that too," she said, "and I hope others can feel it too even after I'm gone." A man from the crowd spoke up, his voice shaking with emotion. "How did you survive everything and still carry this music with you?" She looked at him with a faint smile. "Life isn't always fair," she said. "Sometimes it takes everything away, but it cannot take what is inside. Music, love, hope. These are yours, no matter what happens outside." The room grew silent again, not because of fear, but because her words had settled deep inside everyone listening. They realized this was more than a piano performance. It was a lesson in resilience, humility, and humanity. She walked slowly to the door, gathering her coat around her. The staff wanted to offer her a meal, but she shook her head gently. "I am full," she said, "of more than food. I am full of music, of kindness, and of the warmth you've given me." Before leaving, she turned once more to the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys and she pressed a few soft notes. Not a melody, just small, gentle sounds. It was her way of saying goodbye, or maybe thank you, to the instrument that had carried her through so many lonely nights. The crowd watched silently as she stepped out into the cool evening. The lights from the restaurant reflected softly on the wet pavement, and for a moment it seemed as though time had stopped. She walked into the night without hurry, her figure small but strong, leaving behind a place transformed by her presence. The manager stayed by the piano, thinking about the journey she had taken, from asking to play for a meal to sharing her soul with an entire room of strangers. The hostess sat at one of the tables, her hands folded, quietly reflecting on what she had witnessed. Even the young waiters who had once mocked her felt a strange mix of shame and admiration, having learned that appearances could never reveal a person's true worth. The restaurant itself felt different after that night. Patrons returned not just for food, but for the memory of the music, hoping to feel the lingering presence of someone who had shown them that life, despite its hardships, could still offer moments of pure beauty. Days turned into weeks, and while she did not return immediately, her story traveled farther than she could imagine. People wrote about her, shared her tale, and spoke of her music with reverence. She became a quiet inspiration, not famous in the way of celebrities, but known to anyone who had been touched by her melody. And somewhere, far away from the bright lights, she continued to play. On quiet streets and small rooms for anyone who would listen, she played not for recognition, not for money, but for the life it brought her, for the joy it returned to her heart. Every note carried her story. Every melody held a piece of her soul, and anyone fortunate enough to hear it felt a gentle reminder that even the simplest acts could carry extraordinary power. One evening, as she sat by a small window in a quiet room, she played softly for herself. Her fingers glided over the keys with ease, the music filling the air and settling in her chest. She remembered the journey, the hunger, the mockery, the fear, and the quiet moments of courage that had brought her here. And she felt at peace. She had played for a meal once, but now she played for life. She played for hope. She played for the hearts of strangers who had come to know her not by her name or her fame, but by the honesty of her music. And in that quiet room, as her hands moved across the piano, she understood something deeply. The world may take everything from you, but it can never take what truly belongs to your heart. Music had given her strength. Music had given her peace. And through her music, she had given a little piece of herself to the world, a gift that would linger long after the last note faded, a reminder that courage, humility, and beauty can survive even the hardest of lives. And with that, she closed the piano gently, rested her hands on her lap, and let the silence speak for her. It was a silence full of meaning, full of life, full of everything she had become. The journey had started with a simple question: "Can I play for just a meal?" And it had ended with the world listening,